Welcome back to another episode of the Pursuit Zone Adventure Travel Podcast. I am your host, Paul Schmid, and I interview explorers from around the globe to bring you their exciting stories. These are people that dream big, break out of their comfort zones, and take on ambitious pursuits. This is episode 158 with Tim Moss. Tim has a new book out about his round-the-world cycle tour. In this episode, we get into some of the stories about that book. Tim talks about the depression that he went through and how he got out of that before he started the tour. We talk about this cycle tour festival that his wife puts on every year in England. And we talk about the Next Challenge Expedition grant that Tim has founded and helps fund every year to help people get started in adventures of their own. If you want to get in touch, you can send me an email at paul@thepursuitzone.com or leave me a voice message at speakpipe.com/thepursuitzone. And now, let me introduce my guest. Tim Moss has a new book titled With the Sun on Our Right. It chronicles the 16-month round-the-world cycle tour he and his wife Laura began in 2013. Cycling over 13,000 miles in 26 countries and 4 continents. Before this, Tim spent 5 years working in the expedition industry, supporting expeditions on all 7 continents. His own expeditions have included scaling unclimbed mountains in Kyrgyzstan, Bolivia, and Russia, and traveling around the world using 80 different methods of transport, as well as setting the Guinness World Record for the longest distance cycled in a rickshaw. You can learn more about Tim and his adventures at thenextchallenge.org, where he encourages others to go on adventures and offers the Next Challenge Expedition grant each year to help them do so. Tim Moss, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
First of all, let me say congratulations on the book. I read it, and I loved it. It was great. You did a fantastic job.
Well, thank you for that. I'm really glad that you enjoyed it.
It gives the reader a really great taste of what it is like to go on a cycle tour. And I want to also say a thank you to your wife, who was your editor, because I think it was just a fantastically done book, fantastically edited. And you did all of this yourself. It was all self-published.
That's right. Well, that's really good and encouraging to hear. I'll definitely pass it on to Laura. I'm sure she'll appreciate hearing that. I've written a book quite a few years ago, a slightly different subject matter, but that went through a traditional publisher, whereas this time round I consciously chose to self-publish. I didn't approach any publisher to try and go through the traditional model, because this suited me a lot better. But I think the key fear I think people have with a self-published book is you're just not sure of the quality, and particularly the editing, because there's no barriers. You can print anything you could in a book you like, so it's really good to hear that you've read it and you think the editing's decent.
Yeah, I've read some of those books like you're describing, and they're a pain to go through, but it's almost like people take blog posts and just dump them into a book and say I'm done, but that just doesn't cut it. But yeah, you guys did a fantastic job. The book's great. I'd highly encourage people to go and check it out. It's a great story.
Great, thank you.
Your background is very interesting. I wanted to touch on that a little bit. So you worked in the expedition industry for a while. How did you get involved and started in all that?
Well, it was, as with so many of these things, it wasn't something I specifically set out and planned to do. It just sort of stumbled into it, really. Expeditions in general, I happened upon in a similar way. I was into the outdoors as a teenager, and then when I went to university or college, I just saw a poster one day that said that there were expedition grants available for students. So I teamed up with a friend and applied, got a grant, and went climbing in Kyrgyzstan. And then every summer we applied for this same grant, got a new grant for a new idea, and that sort of set me off on this road of the world of expeditions. And then when I finished university, and I finished my master's degree, I was just shopping around for jobs to tide me over until I did a PhD. And I just saw an advert for looking for somebody who had expedition experience to help organise trips for young people. And I thought, I'll do that for a few months until my PhD starts. But I never started that PhD. I just stayed in the expedition world.
This Around the World in 80 Ways, what exactly is that, and how did you get into that?
Well, that was the expedition I did in my final year of university. The first 2 years I'd been on climbing trips, trying to find mountains that had never been scaled before. And the third year we thought, well, if we go back with another climbing idea to this grant, they're going to say, you're doing the same stuff. We're going to give this money to someone else. So we had a brainstorm to try and come up with a novel adventure idea. And we came up with this idea of traveling around the globe using as many different methods of transport as possible. We thought we could come up with 80 different methods. Maybe we could call it Around the World in 80 Ways. And the challenge would be to circumnavigate the globe using each method only once. So that's what we set out to do.
Is this something you came up with on your own, or is this like some sort of an organized thing that happens every year or every so many years?
Entirely something we made up ourselves, just sitting around a table scratching our heads. I think it was actually a third party, if another friend of ours who didn't come on the trip, who suggested the name, but we just made it up ourselves and came up with some rough ideas of a few things, like we know if we're only going to use one train, we'll make sure it's the Trans-Siberian, so it takes us all the way across Europe and Asia, and worked out where we'd have to fly or take a boat across the big bodies of water. And as it happens, when we were planning, we found out there's another group had done something very similar a few years before, again raising money for charity, and completely separate to us. So it was just interesting to talk to them and read about their trip. I think theirs was a much bigger scale and much more impressive than ours. We were just two students doing it on a bit of a budget, but that's what we did. We maybe bent the rules a little bit. We used like a steam train and an electric train, and various different types of bike or boat, but we made it around and got back home again.
Now the rickshaw record, do you still hold this record?
You know what? I think someone beat it a year or so ago. It's one of I've done lots of different adventures, but that rickshaw one is the one I get probably the most people emailing about, saying they want to do something similar. I don't know if they've already got the idea and they find my website, or it's the other way around. They see my website and get the idea. When I first came up with this plan, I thought it'd be a great way to have a sort of challenge, but also raise some money for charity. I'd pedal around in this, daft looking rickshaw, the big flag and a big sign saying Special Olympics, which is who I was raising money for, and then people could hop on and I'd taxi them to work, or just they'd pose for a photo and then they'd give me a few pounds in my pot which I'd give to charity. But when I started planning it, I found out that there was this record, and it wasn't a very long distance. I don't remember, it was a few hundred miles, and my trip was going to be about 1,000. So I just submitted my application to Guinness. They told me what I needed to do, so I set off, did this trip, beat the record. And yeah, for years since, people have been emailing me, I'd like to have a go, and none of them ever did or never succeeded. And then I just realized the other day when I was probably showing off to someone, I've got a Guinness World Record, sent them the link, and they clicked on it, and it's someone else's name now, so somebody else has taken the mantle.
It's only a matter of time.
Exactly, yeah.
So I think when I hear rickshaw, I always think of India or Asia or something. Where were you when you were doing this?
So it was all in the UK, and to start with, I actually signed up with a rickshaw company in London. We have, it's not a huge thing, but in London you can get, in the popular tourist areas, people will go around on rickshaws and take you to the theatre from your restaurant and that sort of thing. It's like a popular thing to do when you're visiting. So I signed up with a company and went through the training. I felt a bit like Homer Simpson learning to ride that bike at the circus, doing all these funny circuits on my rickshaw. I did a few weeks of work, and then I approached the manager and said, look, I've got this idea. I would like to cycle the length of the country and break a world record. Have you got any rickshaws that I could borrow? And he had this battered old one he wasn't using anymore. He sold it to me for a penny, and I just painted it up, oiled the chain, sorted out the brakes, and set off to ride from Scotland back down to London.
During this time, because I know you have sort of other, I don't know if you want to call them books or sort of these online guides that you've written on all these different types of ways to adventure that's on your website, thenextchallenge.org. How did that whole thing come about, and the evolution of the website? When did you start building that?
A few years after I applied for that job I talked about from the advert, and I was working there, I started realizing that although it was cool having a day job that involved organising expeditions for big groups of people. What I realised was that I particularly like just helping individuals, people who just didn't really know how to start. They might have read about my Around the World in 80 Ways trip, or heard that I'd climbed some mountains, so they'd unclimbed mountains. So they'd send me an email saying, oh, I'm planning something similar, or could be quite different, but they wanted help writing a press release or finding sponsors or planning an expedition themselves. And I really enjoyed helping those people. So on a bit of a whim, I ended up deciding that I would quit my day job and start doing that full time, helping other people. And that's when I set up the website to sort of build a bit of a profile and get some attention. And then I'd offer my services to other people to do expedition logistics and give them advice and whatnot. And a bit like you mentioned before about people collating all their blog posts and just putting it into a self-published book, I realized that I'd spent a few years writing 2 articles on my website every single week, 2 articles. And I thought, I'm putting all this time into my blog, I could put half of that time into the blog and half of it into a book. So I spent about 18 months researching and writing a paperback book, which was called How to Get to the North Pole and Other Iconic Adventures. And it's 7 different guides, one about how to row an ocean or how to cross a desert or how to cycle around the world. And now I sell them as each of those chapters as individual ebook guides.
And as I understand it, then the profits from that go into the Next Challenge Expedition grant. Sort of,
yeah. I make, for the years that I used to run my website full time, it made an absolute pittance. It wasn't enough to live on, despite doing it full time. So I'd have to do little side jobs or live with my parents and just never go out and just live as cheaply as possible. Now I've transitioned and I have a normal day job and just do the Next Challenge in my spare time. And what that's meant is that whereas before I couldn't really afford to pay the bills even as a bare minimum, now my job is it's not a fantastically well remunerated job, but it's decent and it pays the bills. So money from my website, either from the books and things like that, I use to help fund my own expeditions, but from the adverts, I have little Google adverts that make a few £100s, a few $100 every year, and that's the money that I give away to through my expedition grant. So anyone who clicks on my advert gives a few pence to me, which goes into my bank account. And at the end of the year, I find someone with a good adventure idea and I give them that money.
Yeah, I want to circle around later on to talk about the grant. But let's get into the cycling part a little bit. The book, With the Sun on Our Right, it chronicles your 16-month round-the-world trip. Kind of why did you want to do this, and what was your objective of this cycling adventure?
Oh, yeah, big question. The day that Laura, my now wife, and I first met, we went on our first date and we were out for a couple of drinks in the evening. And as you do on your first date, you start talking about big stuff like hopes and dreams for the future. And we can't remember which one of us it was said it first, but one of us blurted out that one day we'd like to go on a big bike trip. And the other one was like, oh, that's funny because, I'd love to do that too. And we joked, even though it was only our first date, we put a date in the diary for a few years later and said, okay, that's when we're going to cycle around the world. And we became a couple and we lived together and we got married. And this idea kept coming up, and neither of us was sure if the other one was joking or not, but we realized over time that actually we were both dead serious. We really did want to go off on a big long bike trip. So we worked out when would be the best time to do it. It's never easy to work around jobs. Laura's a solicitor, a lawyer. She spent years training and had a good career, and lots of her colleagues thought it would be career suicide to quit and ride a bike for a year, but that's just exactly what we did. We both handed in our notices at work, moved out of our houses, and set off to cycle east.
What budget did you set for yourself, or what did you think that you would need?
I can't remember it. We did do a little bit of a budget in advance. I'm training as an accountant now, so I'm always into nerdy spreadsheets and numbers, so it suited me. And I know the whole trip cost us about £6,000, which is the exchange rate, I guess, probably somewhere around $8,000 or so US, and that's per person, and that's for 16 months of traveling, and that includes every pound and penny that we spent. So not just the daily expenditure on food, But every time we needed to get a flight or repair our bikes or pay for visas, those sorts of things are all go into that pot. So we're talking about less than £400, so perhaps less than $500 a month for the year and a half that we were away, which is a lot less than even just the rent would have been on our flat, our apartment in London before we left. And it's certainly the cheapest either of us have ever lived.
Would you have wanted to do it for any less than that?
I think we were pretty happy with our balance. We'd read books about people who do it on an absolute shoestring and just eat like bread and bananas every day because it was the cheapest thing they could find, and just have just plain pasta with nothing in it in the evenings, and really scrape the barrel and spend 3 hours searching for the cheapest accommodation if they have to stay in a town. We were pretty tight on our budget. We'd only have like a few pounds or dollars per day that we'd stick to, but on occasions, if times were really rough and we were suffering or it was freezing cold and we'd had enough of camping outside in it, or one of us was sick, we had a little luxury pot where we would dip into it and say, look, for the sake of £10 in Southeast Asia or $30 in the US, we'd find a roof for the night and stay indoors. And that luxury pot worked really well. It was money that friends had given us. Like, for example, when Laura left her job, her boss just thought she was crazy. She's like, that sounds awful, spending a year on a bike. So I'm going to give you, I can't remember, say it was something like £100. And I want you to use that for something nice, like a hotel or a spa day or whatever. So we kept this money to one side. And when it came to the rough times, we'd think we can't afford this from the daily budget, but there's that luxury pot that Laura's boss wanted us to use. So we'll dip into that and find ourselves somewhere nice for the evening.
Tell me about your bike.
Right. Well, we were really lucky to be given 2 bicycles off the back of having my website, which I've been running for years and built up a big following and lots of sort of social media followers and whatnot. We had some presence there. So we wrote to various companies and said, we're doing this big trip. I get this many visitors on my website and I've got this many followers. Do you think this would be useful to you? And one of the companies that responded was Ridgeback, a British bike manufacturer. And they gave us 2 of their Panorama touring bikes. They're sort of traditional steel framed touring bikes. They've got drop handlebars, 700c racing sort of road bike wheels, front and back racks, 27 gears, all the works. And they did a sterling job on our way around the world. And it was actually really good. We felt it was quite a generous thing to be given these 2 bikes, but we would take photographs of us, with me with a big beard, snow in it in Turkey, or pushing it through sand in the Omani desert or whatever like that. And they send these images back to Ridgeback, and then they'd use them in their advertising campaign. So our friends and family would see a bike magazine, and on the back cover there'd be a big picture of one of us, and at the bottom it would say Tim and Laura cycling around the world on a Ridgeback Panorama. So it was really nice. We felt like we hadn't abused their generosity. We'd actually given them something back.
Yeah, that's neat to have your family just see you in an advertisement.
It was good, and it was great. It was a nice relationship because they could tell us which photos they liked and which ones didn't really work, and then we could adjust it and make sure that in the next country we'd get sort of pictures that were useful to them.
Before you started the adventure, kind of what were the barriers in your mind, or kind of what were you maybe afraid of before you got started that maybe in the end turned out to be nothing?
Right. So there's sort of 2 elements to that. There's lots of fairly mundane things that we were bothered about, like what equipment would we need, and we were worried in particular about the winter, which we knew we'd hit in Turkey and Iran, which would be very cold, be sort of down to minus 20 centigrade, which you'll have to convert to Fahrenheit for me, I'm afraid. But we were sort of worried about that, and we were concerned about getting over the French and Swiss Alps. Crossing a mountain range on our bike sounded like hard work, but the Alps in particular turned out to be just not a walk in the park. It was still a tough day, but it was just, we realized it was a nice day. The sun was shining. We had low gears on our bike, so we could just pootle along and just chat, and it wasn't like a grueling experience. It was something we worried about for ages, but turned out to be fine. I think the bigger barrier that was the biggest hurdle before we set off was my mental health. We've been planning this trip for such a long time. But at the time I was working from home on doing the expedition stuff on my own, just working on my website. And I was really struggling with sort of like self-confidence and esteem issues. And we did a little practice training trip, just going to cycle the length of England. We didn't think we needed to do much sort of physical training, but we thought we should do a big bike trip and just check that we still enjoy it. And on the second day, I just couldn't. We were meant to be going up a hill. I just couldn't do it, couldn't muster the energy. So I ended up walking, and Laura had never seen me push my bike up a hill before. I just set that record on the rickshaw. So I was used to really hard physical exercise, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And over time, I just found myself struggling more and more with anxiety and what turned out to be depression. And I just couldn't ride my bike anymore. I just didn't have the willpower. And in the end, we had to cancel our plans to go on this big bike trip. And whilst I got help and spent a year getting better, and then we got back on the road, then we quit our jobs. And once I was back to my normal self, we were able to set off again.
Yeah, that was interesting. When I was reading through that part, do you think it was totally attributed to just kind of working for yourself and being solo? I guess I'm kind of going to ask two questions at once here. And what was it that finally pulled you out of it?
Yeah, good questions. It definitely wasn't just attributable to working at home on my own. I think I had some sort of faulty logic in my head about how I responded to things, like any sort of criticisms I got, or things that weren't even criticisms, maybe just a bit of feedback on something. I'd take them to mean that somebody didn't like me, and that if someone didn't like me, that meant I was a bad person. So I was sort of these really, really minor instances. Like I remember going to play netball with Laura's work team one evening, and I got told that I fouled somebody, and I just thought, I didn't foul somebody. Why is the umpire, the referee got something in for me? What's the problem? And then I thought, maybe I did foul them. Maybe I'm the kind of person that fouls people. Maybe I'm a bad person. I remember it was utterly ridiculous thought process to go through. But when we were cycling home after this netball match, there were the tears rolling down my cheeks. I just thought, I'm a terrible person that goes around fouling people at work netball matches. So this daft, stupid logic in my head was there. And then because I was working at home with no colleagues to sort of tell me I'd done a good job, the only feedback I was getting was from social media, which isn't always the most subtle instrument. So I think it just really compounded things, and not having human interactions other than just sitting at home on my own just made it ferment and made it a lot worse. And then what dragged me out was a real combination of things. I tried all sorts of treatments. I had various different medications, had like group therapy. I trained in counseling and Buddhist mindfulness. I think the treatment that worked best for me was CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, because it's sort of talking things through, very logical, and that appeals for me. I'm quite introspective. I like thinking things through, and if I can see the faulty logic in my head and work out ways to address it, that really helps. But that kind of a combination of, so the drugs probably helped a bit, that therapy, Laura was a really, really tough time, as you could probably imagine, but Laura sticking by me and helping me out, helping me through it the whole time, with no way I would have done it without her. And then combined, that sort of lifted me up a bit, and then I got a normal day job, and that really helped. So once I'd done those things, after a year or so, I felt like I was though I'd never wish it upon anyone, I definitely felt like I was a stronger person for it, and I'd learned a lot from it. So was ready to get on the bike.
A lot of the book is, you write about the people that you meet along the way. I've interviewed some people that their around the world cycle tour is all about speed. So they don't have the time really to have the interactions with people every day, and maybe they don't want to. When was it on your adventure that you decided, you know what, this isn't about how fast we go, it's more about taking the time and going slow and having interactions with these people that we meet?
When we set off, we knew it was never going to be all about the miles. We weren't in a position to be setting any records for speed, even if we wanted to. So we didn't, that was never going to be our plan. But there was still a little bit of us that was used to just churning out some miles, getting through the day and moving on quickly. I think we're both quite focused, quite project driven. So we were like, right, the project is cycle around the world. So that the objective therefore is to get to here as sort of quickly as possible. But it was only in we only got as far as Switzerland, our second country after leaving the UK, when it first hit us that our mentality was wrong. I think we'd just woken up after camping out in some woods, and we were just wheeling our bikes back to the road when a lady came over to us and seen our bikes with our panniers and all of our equipment, started chatting to us, said that she was a cyclist herself, and a few years ago she'd hosted someone else, a young lady that was cycling around the world, and this woman offered to take us in, put us up for the night, cook us dinner and share a bottle of wine. And we just said, actually, it's first thing in the morning. We've not cycled anywhere today. We're across the Alps, so thanks, but no thanks. And then about half a mile down the road, Laura and I were chatting it, and we just thought, this is ridiculous. Like, we can cycle any day of the week, but it's pretty rare that a local corners you and says, come and stay for the night. And you don't often get the chances to meet people and see inside their homes and get home cooked food and hear other people's stories. So we just thought we'd resolved there and then that when people offer, we're going to accept. This trip's going to be all the richer for the people we meet rather than just the tarmac miles that we cover.
One of the things that you guys had to facilitate meeting locals and staying with them was this thing you call the magic letter. How did that the idea for the magic letter come about?
The magic letter, as we describe it, is a letter that works magic. It's a simple few phrases that have been translated into the local language, and it would say something like, "Hi, we're Tim and Laura. We're a married couple. We've cycled X thousand miles from the UK. Is there somewhere safe that we can sleep?" And we'd always say, we've got our own tent, we've got a stove, we've got food. All we need is your blessing that you think it's okay to put our tent there, and point us to a tap where we can fill up our water bottles. The idea came from, I think it must be reasonably common among cyclists. I got it personally from Alistair Humphreys, who's another well-known round-the-world cyclist who had something similar on his trip. So we prepared many of them in advance, got friends to translate them for us. And it was genuinely magic. You would knock on a door, hold up this bit of paper. The person would look at you like you're crazy because you've turned up with a beard and covered in dust, and you've got this big bike. About 30 seconds later, after scanning this letter, the big grin would break out and they'd wave you inside. So often, wouldn't even bother saying, put your tent up. They'd just say, don't be daft, come and sleep in the spare room and join us for dinner. And that just happened time and time and time again in pretty much every country that we visited.
You spent a lot of time in Turkey. I think it was 7 weeks. What did you like most about Turkey, and what the flip side, what did you like the least?
The two things that were best about Turkey were probably the hospitality and the history of it. So we'd had been hosted in other countries, people, complete strangers inviting us into their homes. But in Turkey, it was just a different league. We were there for 7 weeks. We only used our tent on 3 nights because almost every other evening, somebody would just say, come on inside, don't be sleeping outside in the cold. And what was great was that I just didn't know a lot about Turkey at all, but staying with all these different people, we learned all about its history and their great leader Ataturk and all that he did during the wars. We got to try loads of different types of food. We started learning little bits of the language, so we could refer to our bikes and our jobs, our family in the local language, just little things to make conversation easier. And then we'd stay with people. We stayed with one guy who was in the Taksim Square protests, which made the news a few years back. He was there when the bulldozers and the tear gas came in. He was, had a big problem with the government there. Erdogan, the president, who's sort of quite right-wing and traditional, he wasn't a big fan of him at all. And then it was really interesting because a few weeks later we'd stay with a family in a rural setting, more traditional lifestyle, and they'd be big supporters of Erdogan and his government. So you'd get to hear it from both sides rather than just reading about it in the newspapers. In terms of what we enjoyed least, I suppose what hit us first in Turkey was the temperatures, the cold. As soon as we left Istanbul and went into Anatolia, the eastern part of Turkey, it never went above -5 Celsius. It was always below freezing and often down to -15 or -20 Celsius, with piles of snow stacked up chest height at the side of the road. And it just meant that every day you had to be diligent about keeping your hands and your feet warm. If you stopped for a pee or you stopped for your lunch, you have to do everything quickly and keep going again. And because it was winter, obviously it was dark most of the time. Sun was only up from something like 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. So you had these really short days of cold riding. And in many ways, we really loved it. We were looking forward to that as the sort of more adventurous part. It was just after so long of doing it, it just gets quite tiring.
Was it India that came after Turkey?
There were a few other places before that. We went briefly through Armenia and Georgia, and then through Iran, which was really interesting. And then a very short trip through the United Arab Emirates, Dubai and the like, and Oman. And then we went into India after that.
What was your favorite part of Iran?
Well, Iran is got to be the people. We'd heard from lots of friends who'd been there that they're really friendly, hospitable people, but you can't help but think about all the stuff you hear in the news about the Ayatollahs and accusations of terrorism and nuclear weapons. So when we crossed that border, we were pretty nervous, especially because we did it at 3 o'clock in the morning or something like that, cycling around this deserted city and worried about what Iran was going to hold for us. But I remember a car started following us down this dark street, and we noticed it was tailing us, so we started taking turns down side streets to get away from it. It kept following us until it pulled up next to me, wound the window down, and I was just terrified. I gripped my handlebars thinking, what on earth's going to happen here? But the guy just said, "Welcome to Iran, welcome to my country," pointed at his wife in the passenger seat, said, "This is my wife, this is my son, you must come to our house for tea." And we found that everywhere we went. People would literally shout at us in the streets, "Welcome to Iran, come to my house." And for many, many times over the weeks that we were there, people would invite us in, put us up for the night, for even several days sometimes, take us around the city, make food for us. And when it came time to leave, repeatedly they would say, "What did you think about Iran before you came here?" Because they know that their reputation is for nuclear weapons and terrorism. And they said, "What do you think about Iran now?" And obviously we weren't just being polite when we'd say it's a really friendly place with, it's really enjoyed our time. And all of them would say, "Now go home and tell your friends," because they hate the fact that their reputation is for this bad stuff when really it should be for hospitality.
Well, I know that India was a challenging time for you guys because at least half the time you were there, you were sick. I pulled a quote out of your book. Would you mind if I read it? And then afterwards, maybe you can comment about some of your time in India and what you thought of it.
Of course, yeah, please do.
All right, here's the quote. "We spent the night in his spare room, but in a depressingly familiar routine. I woke in the early hours of the morning and had to run to the toilet. With nowhere else available on our way to Jaipur, we had eaten lunch at a cafe where we saw cockroaches run across our table and a bird defecate into a cooking pot." Wow, that's quite a scene in that little restaurant. So yeah, fill me in on India and the challenges.
Well, the first thing to say is that there was a lot about India that was brilliant. It was just such a fascinating place, full of life and colour, and you just when things were going right, you couldn't help but smile all the time, completely bewildered about what on earth's going on, why there are cows in the middle of the road, and why traffic's coming towards you on the wrong side of the road, and how on earth there are so many people everywhere all trying to sell you stuff. And so a lot of it we really did enjoy, but as you said, probably more than any other country that we visited, it was challenging. I think that was a combination of the illnesses that we got. Obviously, getting sort of Delhi belly is a very common thing to happen in India, and we did our best to avoid it. We did all the things you're supposed to do. We only drank bottled water. We purified it wherever possible. We would sort of cook our own food where we could. But the thing was that we weren't in popular tourist destinations most of the time. We were out in the middle of nowhere in rural Rajasthan, and we might cycle for days without seeing anything approaching a decent restaurant, and we'd live off crisps and biscuits because that's all we could get. But eventually the only thing we could find might be like a little roadside shack like the one you just read about that was selling dal, and the hygiene standards would be rock bottom. You'd watch the chef wipe his nose and then serve you food with his hands. The dishes were just rinsed with cold water, and that's tap water that you shouldn't be drinking anyway. But it was sometimes the only choice that we had. So the illness was really difficult. And then that combined with the fact that it was really hot. We know we'd been to other hot countries before and after, but I think when you're sick, that's really hard, being out in 40 degrees plus centigrade. I guess that's over 100 Fahrenheit. And then getting a lot of attention. The social norms in India are clearly just completely different from here in the UK and much of the West. If in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same in the US, someone funny looking walks past, you might sort of quietly give them a bit of a look, but if they catch you looking, you sort of look away and feel a bit embarrassed. But in India, staring is absolutely par for the course. So we'd be out in the middle of the desert, stopping to eat some biscuits, and a motorbike would pull up next to us, turn his engine off and just stare at us. We'd smile and wave, and you might nod a bit back, but mostly we'd just stare, and we'd be there, and I'd go to the toilet, he'd still stare at us, and then more people would come round. You'd get like a crowd of 20, 30 people just watching you. Sometimes they'll play with your bike, test the brakes, maybe even have a little nose inside your bags. To us, that seemed really almost confrontational and quite rude, but it genuinely, I think, is just normal behaviour there. And at the start, when we're in a good mood, it's just funny. You'd laugh along and you'd let people have a try on the bike, and you'd try and make someone laugh when they're just staring at you. But when you've been ill and for weeks and it's really hot and people are just getting in your way and really not cooperating, it just got really quite tiring. So that's why in the end, after a few weeks of it, we decided to cut our losses. We knew we'd have to fly out of India anyway because most of the borders are closed, so it's tricky to get out, but we just cut our trip a little short and hopped on a plane to escape.
You mentioned in the book about the physical challenges of cycling and how your body adjusts to that, but like the mental challenge, all the India stuff that you just mentioned that you have to put up with, how do you, over this long period of time, how do you deal with these mental challenges? What do you do, and what techniques and what things do you do to kind of relieve the strain from that?
I think, that's an interesting question, because I genuinely think that the physical stuff, that's probably what most people will bang on about. But the truth is it's just not that tough. If you can cycle a bike for a day, you can probably do it for a few days. And if you do it for a few days, you'll get stronger and you can do it for a few weeks and months. But yeah, the mental stuff was interesting because it's harder to prepare for. What we found after a few weeks is that we actually would get sort of almost bored on our bikes, and felt like our brains were wasting away a little bit, because although it's great getting that much exercise and physical exertion, a lot of the time you're just communicating in pidgin English and mime because you don't speak the local language. So we started, obviously we've been reading anyway, but we started listening to podcasts and audiobooks on our bikes. It's not something I'd ever dream of when I'm cycling to work, but out in the middle of nowhere, popping in one earphone and listening to talk radio, it's perfect. It didn't present any sort of dangers. It was perfectly safe. And we found that because the rest of our world's complications of modern life had been shut away and a few months behind us, we had a huge mental capacity to sort of process things, and we could read much heavier books and weighty tomes than you might do at home, and listen to sort of economics and historical and political podcasts and books. And to the extent that by the end of our year and a half on the road, it almost felt like we'd done a master's degree in study, because we'd just been reading and listening to so much and then talking to each other about the things we'd read. So in some ways it was a great opportunity to expand our minds with books and audiobooks.
You'd also taken some time off to stop and visit friends, and your family came out and visited you on a couple occasions. How big of a help was that?
Yeah, I think that was really important. Again, I think a little bit like how, although we had a really tight budget, we'd occasionally, I think perhaps being slightly older, we were just around about 30 when we set off. We weren't absolutely dogmatic about scraping every penny and cent. I think similarly, we felt like we don't have to be rushing this the whole time. It's okay to, if we're tired either mentally or physically, to take a few days off in a city or stop with friends and have family come out to see us. And that stuff is great because you can forget about the sort of the burden of the big cycling trip and just shoot the breeze and chat and catch up, and also just the ability to talk to someone that wasn't your spouse. I mean, we love each other, but all day, every day for a year and a half, you do sometimes run out of things to talk about. And then the fact that, yeah, as I said, lots of the conversations with local people would be quite stilted because there's limited language. So suddenly to have fresh blood to talk to in a native language was great opportunity too.
I want to talk a little bit about your time in South Korea, because this bike trail, the Four Rivers cycle path, and it sounds amazing. Tell me a little bit about that path and what was your time like in South Korea?
Well, I think amazing probably is just about the right word for describing South Korea's cycle network. We never planned to go to South Korea. I didn't know a lot about it, and I certainly didn't have it down on my list of cycling destinations. But somebody that we stayed with in India had been there recently and was raving about how good it was. So when it came to book our flights out of India, we were supposed to be going to Southeast Asia, into Vietnam, but we were looking on a flight scanning website and just noticed that we could actually get up to South Korea quite cheaply. And we figured, well, we're getting on a plane anyway, so why not hop up there? So we had almost like a holiday within a holiday, and trooped up to Korea and then got a boat to Japan before we carried on in Southeast Asia. And the reason South Korea is so good for cycling is that a few years ago, I think it must have been the president or the prime minister embarked on this fairly controversial project to dam several of the rivers, and it wasn't very popular. And as a bit of a PR stunt, he decided, well, let's just put a bike lane next to the rivers while we're doing all these dams. And it sounds like the least likely thing in the world to work, but actually it's been fantastic. You can now cycle the entire length of the country almost entirely traffic free on perfectly smooth bike paths through lots of beautiful scenery. Every few miles there are these little stations where you can go in and put a stamp in your little toy passport that proves where you've been, so you can get a certificate and a medal at the end. There are like hydraulic bike pumps at the side of the road and boiling hot water urns so you can make instant noodles or get yourself a coffee, and pagodas everywhere to sleep under. And it was just some of the most idyllic, blissful cycling we'd done of our whole trip.
So you guys kind of wild camped each night under these pagodas. Did you run into any issues with people trying to shoo you away?
No, we never had any problems at all. We would usually just wild camp anywhere, and because the weather happened to be very good in South Korea, we'd often just be in our bivvy bags, no tent, so just sleeping out under the stars, which is neater and easier, and it's also a bit less intrusive and controversial. I think fewer people are going to object to you just lying down on the grass than they are to you erecting a tent. But we found I really liked having the pagodas. It meant when it did rain, we had shelter. It meant you had a seat to sit on, which sounds like a small thing, but if you're sitting on the floor for a year and a half, you start to appreciate a good chair. And no, we never had anyone sort of kick us off. They were just like an elaborate park bench, I guess, at the side of the road, and often miles from any town, so we'd very rarely see anybody, and they just made the ideal sort of semi-wild spot.
Hey, I also want to touch upon Japan. Cycling in Japan seems like it would be just such a neat experience with all the old architecture and just how Japan is so, I don't know what I want to say because I've never been there, so I don't really know, but it seems like Japan hasn't kind of westernized itself. It seems like it's held itself together as a strange place. What did you find the experience of cycling like to be there?
Well, for someone that hasn't been there, I think you've pretty much summed it up spot on. It's absolutely unique. I think it hasn't westernized like many other countries have, but at the same time, it's obviously very modern, hyper modern almost. It's not like it's just less developed, it's just developed differently. And that's, I think, partly because of the history of it. For many, many years, it was proactively isolationist, didn't want to trade with anybody. When the US sent over boats for trade, they said, no thanks, we're happy as we are. And even now, I don't remember the exact figures, but I think it's something like in the high 90 percentile of people are ethnic Japanese. There's not a huge amount of diversity as you might get in somewhere like London or New York. So it just means that it's really different, it's really wacky and really interesting. You have all this interesting culture and history and delicious food and just a lot of baffling things that make you just shake your head with a smile because you just don't know what on earth's going on, but really enjoyable. And in fact, one of the only downside to this South Korea path was, although it was very welcome for us at the time, it was quite cut off from society. We didn't go through lots of towns. We were out in nature by the river the whole time, so we didn't get a huge immersion in the culture. Whereas in Japan, there was no such cycle route that we're following. We're constantly in suburbs and towns and cities and meeting lots of people. So it was really great to get more exposure to the culture and history there.
Did you find that it was pretty easy to navigate there and pretty safe to ride on the roads in terms of, not being run over by cars?
Yeah, we found Japan to be fine for cycling. I think I'd actually been there a couple of times before, but only briefly and mostly to Tokyo. So my images of Japan tended to be sort of a mega city with back-to-back traffic and loads of cars everywhere. But we started in the southwest on one of the smaller islands and one of the quieter ones, and turned out that the roads were all pretty quiet, pretty civilized, and I think it's the law, but certainly in most places you can cycle on the sidewalk, on the pavement. So whenever it was busy, you just hop up onto the side and you'd be away from the cars. So actually it was quite peaceful and no problem at all with traffic.
I spoke to another bearded cyclist. I don't remember which one, but he was called Chuck Norris when he was going through Africa. And you also, because you had grown a beard, got all kinds of people calling you different names of characters or whatever, celebrities. Give me some examples, and then what was your favorite?
For whatever reason, it seemed to be that whatever country I would be in, the people there would call me the name of some great leader from its past. Often, well, I say great, often it'd be like some horrible dictator, but in the sort of Eastern Europe, people would shout at me that Lenin. When I got to Vietnam, people were shouting at me Ho Chi Minh, who's just this tiny diminutive guy with a little wispy beard, which is nothing like me at all, but that's what he just shout on the street, Ho Chi Minh. And in India, I think probably my favorite was people would shout Ali Baba at me, who almost certainly cannot have had a ginger beard, but that was just, I think people just saw the beard and saw the opportunity.
I never get tired of asking that question. That's funny. All right, so people ask you all kinds of strange questions. One I wrote down in my notes was, were you in CSI? Which at first I thought that's really a weird question, but then I'm like, oh, well, maybe they think he looks like the David Caruso guy. What other kind of strange questions did people ask you?
Well, things like that would happen fairly often, and because I don't know who it was in CSI was supposed to look like. I think it was me rather than Laura. But then after that, the next question was, were you in CSI Miami? And I just had to sort of set the record straight. I'm from the West, but I'm not a TV star. And they would have the same thing. Were you in Doctor Who? Were you in this? Were you in that? Some of the most common questions in some of the perhaps more developing countries, that we would always be asked where our children were and why didn't we have children, when were we going to have children. And religion was a really, really popular one. Places like Turkey and Iran constantly asked. Lots of people in the Middle East would get excited seeing my beard and think I was Muslim, and sometimes I just didn't have the heart to disappoint them, so I just shout Muslim brother back at them when they shouted at me in the street. So those are the sorts of things we got asked about.
You spent a lot of time in the USA cycling across. I'm not surprised that the USA came up as like the worst country to cycle across in terms of safety from vehicles. Not surprising at all. But you put in there also in your book, Switzerland was up there with the USA in terms of danger of being hit by a car. Why Switzerland? That surprised me.
Yeah, I mean, it surprised us as well. And I should probably say that we were in Switzerland for perhaps a week. So it's a very small sample. And all it takes is a few people having a bad day to taint your memories of it. So I wouldn't really want to damn the whole country. But what it was, I think it was partly in contrast to France, which is probably the most respectful drivers for cyclists in the world. It's really nice, quiet roads anyway. But I think perhaps the cycling history in the Tour de France means that you get more people waving their hands and shouting chapeau and honking their horns in support rather than you do getting angry. I think in Switzerland, had lots of big sort of expensive cars, fast roads, and I remember in particular when we were slogging our way up the Alps, there's a bit near the top where the road gets quite narrow, and obviously on heavy bikes we're travelling only a couple of miles an hour, and cars behind would be honking their horns and getting angry, and you're just thinking, well, there's only one road over this mountain. There's only so fast I can go. So you're just going to have to wait. So like I said, though, only a very small sample, and still I'm sure 90% of the drivers were good to us.
Your book was a lot about the people that you met along the way. And you met some strange people, I will say, from your descriptions of them in your book, which I want to give you the opportunity to at least pick out one. I know that's kind of a tough question sometimes, but what kind of one, looking back, who's the one person that stands out in your mind that you met through your trip?
Well, it's tough to pick one because there were so many and all interesting for different reasons, whether it's might be a weirdness or kindness or the most interesting story. But I think the one that stands out the most is a lady called Juanita, who we met quite near the end of our trip in Louisiana. She lived right down near the coast on a place called, I think it's called Pecan Island, which was devastated by Hurricane Rita a few years before we visited. And the whole island and her community had been destroyed, washed away. I'm pretty sure her house was washed away as part of it. But for whatever reason now, where she lived was prime real estate. I think it was of interest to hunters perhaps. And she reckoned she'd been offered $1 million for this patch of land, but she said she had no interest in it. As she put it, where would she go without her dirt? And so she rebuilt her house on the same spot, right close to the sea, presumably at risk of the next hurricane washing it away. She also referenced the fact that she'd been an alcoholic. We were impressed by the fact that when we turned up only a few hours after she invited us in, that she'd caught some crayfish in the back garden, made us tea with homemade pesto, baked us a cake, and looked after all of these rescue dogs. And we asked her how she had the time, and she just said that she had a lot more time on her hands now that she wasn't an alcoholic. So she'd been through all of this, and she was still hosting strangers quite regularly. I think it must get a lot of cyclists there. She just flagged us down at the side of the road, invited us into her house, looked after us, packed us off with food and drink the next day, and just a sort of remarkable human being, really.
You were supporting the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. Are you still doing that? And do you want to encourage people to support that? Or is there a link or something you might want to send them to?
The easier name for it is just the acronym of JDRF. Yeah, as you said, it's a charity for people with type 1 diabetes, and it's aiming to help make their lives easier and ultimately to eradicate diabetes of that type. It's something that is conceivable, some possible to do. And we have a friend who suffers with type 1 diabetes, and she's into the outdoors and cycling, and we see how the difficulty she goes through to manage and cope with those things whilst doing exercise and being outside. And she now works for JDRF, so it seemed like the perfect opportunity to raise the profile a bit and raise a little bit of money for them in the process. So our personal sort of direct fundraising is that closed a little while after our trip, but you can still go to jdrf.org.uk to read more about it and make donations there.
So your wife puts on a cycle touring festival over in England. I'm curious about that. You know, what is it about and how many people attend and so on?
Right. Well, whilst we were on our cycling trip, we were in Iran as it happened. We were thinking about all these people that we'd heard about who'd done similar trips, or we'd emailed or followed on Twitter to get help and advice or hear their stories. And we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could get all those people in one place to share stories with each other and have a drink and tell tales. So whilst we were on our trip, Laura started planning this festival. She booked a venue by email back home for after our cycling had finished. And the setup is that it's a non-profit event. It's entirely organised by Laura with help from me and her mum and other family members around her full-time job. And the idea is to bring together everyone that's interested in cycle touring. And by that, we just mean any bike trip that lasts longer than a day. And the people that come in includes round-the-world cyclists, people who've crossed Siberia or Africa, to people who just spend the odd week or two on their summer holidays riding a bike, to other people who don't even own a bike yet but quite like the sound of it. So you get this whole range of experience. And it's the event is somewhere between a festival and a conference, in that the full weekends, a timetable. At any given time, there'll be 2 or 3 different talks or workshops. So it might be someone telling a story about a trip they've done. It might be showcase session suggesting interesting places to cycle you might not have thought of before, like South Korea, for example, or practical workshops on bike maintenance or how to wild camp without getting caught or bushcraft or anything like that. And we get about 250 to 300 people each year, and it just seems to be getting better and better. We're not quite sure what the magic ingredient is, but I think it's something to do with the fact that it's family run, it's non-profit, and everyone there has got stories to tell and experience to share, and it's not just sort of 10 speakers at the front who are the experts just dictating knowledge. It's a real sort of collaborative effort where everyone gets involved.
Yeah, that's a good sized turnout. Do you ever get anybody from North America there?
I'm trying to think. I think we must have had a couple. We often get people from the US asking to speak, but our budget's not big enough to cover flights just yet. But yeah, we get people from all over the world, and then certainly people who've come to it and then gone to the US on their cycling trips.
I've often thought, I mean, it's a great concept. I love the idea of it. I've been thinking to myself, wow, is that something that could be pulled off here in the United States? And I kind of wonder, because the country here is so big, if you could pull in enough crowd. But yeah, I think it works perfect in England.
It does, yeah. I mean, yeah, we put it as fairly central in the country. People still complain about how long it takes them to get there, but we just do it here because it's where we live. But it is great, and we don't pay for any advertising or marketing. It's mostly just word of mouth now, and people who've been in previous years putting up flyers in their local bike shop. But we've never had a problem selling the tickets. We don't have an exact cap, but it's more or less selling out each year. We just keep selling until we need to let the caterers know, and then you still get a few people more on the final day saying, "Oh, I missed it. Can I missed the deadline? Can I still come?" And it's just great to see it growing.
Well, let's talk a bit about the next expedition grant. And first of all, how many years have you been doing this?
So the grant, I started 4 years ago. So it would have been 2014, I think, that we made the first round of awards to potential adventurers. And
how do people apply?
Well, so the application I've kept as simple as possible, because I know from experience that you can often spend weeks completing an elaborate application form, and then I've been on the other side of the coin where I get the application form to review for someone else's grant and realise within the first 2 lines that it doesn't meet the criteria. So I try to keep it simple so people don't waste a lot of their time. So you just fill a short Google form online through my website. And the reason I set up the grant is that when I was younger, I was lucky. I got lots of those grants through my university and similar. And after that, I spent years helping people, giving out free advice. But as I mentioned, I'd never made enough money to live off myself, let alone to give any away. But now that I have a normal job that pays the bills, I'm in the lucky position where if I get a couple of £100, a few $100 each year from adverts, I can give that money away to help fund other people's trips. And it's really nice now to be able to, even though there's small amounts I'm giving away, to just be able to help people, give them a little helping hand to get their adventure ideas off the ground.
And you don't just give away one award, there's multiple. How many people typically can win each year?
I think when I started, I imagined it would just be one award. The first year, it was just £200 that I had, so whatever that is, $250. But then I started taking donations from the public. I asked 100 people to match my funding, £2 each, just the price of, not even the price of a beer probably, just donate that. And you can match my funding. So then at the end of it, we'll have £400 we can give away. And when I announced that, lots of other people with adventure websites and adventurers said, I'll give you £200, I'll give you £200. And by the end of it, we had somewhere around £1,500. So we're pushing $2,000. And I got all these application ideas. And because I'm particularly keen to help smaller trips rather than big expeditions, I'm never going to fund someone to ski to the South Pole. And I kind of feel like if you've got the wherewithal and the experience to do an Antarctic expedition, you probably don't need help from me. But if you're 17 and you've never done a trip before and you just want to go on your first mini adventure, or maybe you're even in your 50s, you're retired and you've never done anything like it before, but you just want to give it a try, those are the kind of people I'm trying to reach. And those trips don't tend to cost huge amounts of money. So I give away a couple of £100 each. And as much as anything, I think it's the sort of the endorsement and the the thumbs up to say, yeah, I think this is a good idea. And then people think, oh, well, now I have to do it because I've won this grant.
Do you get people from the US that apply?
Absolutely, yeah. We've had people from all over the world, like Ukraine and India and Cameroon, and certainly, a few Americans from the US and a couple of Canadians. There was one guy who was planning to walk from Death Valley to the summit of Mount Whitney. It was one of the ideas we had recently. And there was a Canadian girl who wanted to spend 100 nights camping in a single year. And this was whilst studying. So it wasn't like she quit a job and dedicated itself to it. She'd just finish her studies one day and go off into the hills and camp somewhere. And she managed it over 360 days. She spent 100 of them outside under the stars.
And this is not something that people can apply to year round. There's typically like a window, right? Is there a certain time frame of the year that people should be kind of looking out for?
Yes. Now it's been going for a few years. I'll start trying to standardize it, but typically it opens the end of summer and closes at the December 31st. So as long as you apply somewhere in that window, it doesn't matter. It's not first come, first serve. It's whoever's there by 31st of December. That's when I'll review them all and start issuing grants at the start of next year.
Well, Tim, what is on the horizon for you?
Well, since our cycling trip, we've done a few other expeditions. Last year we walked across Lake Baikal in Siberia. It freezes every winter. We walked across it dragging our food in sleds. We also did a climbing trip to Morocco, which was great. And as you might have mentioned at the start, we just come back from a couple of weeks cycling in Denmark. But I think at the moment, the two focuses are going to be promoting the book that I've just written. It doesn't come naturally to me going around shouting about my own work, but having spent so many years putting all this effort and writing into it, it makes sense to go and tell a few people about it and see if we can sell some copies. And then I think probably expanding the grant. It wasn't what I set out the website to do originally. I thought I would use it as a way to make money, not give it away. But now I've realized that's much more interesting to me. So just reaching more people and trying to get more people into adventure who might not normally have the opportunity, and hopefully using the Next Challenge grant to help with that.
How can people contact you if they want to learn more?
The two main ways are either through my website, thenextchallenge.org. You can read about all my adventures, my latest blog updates and the grants there. And there's obviously a contact and email address if you want to get in touch directly. And then I'm on most of the big social media platforms. So on Twitter and Instagram, I'm just at Next Challenge. And on Facebook, just go to /the Next Challenge.
Okay, Tim Moss, his new book, With the Sun on Our Right, about his and his wife's 16-month cycling adventure around the world. Great read. I encourage everybody to check it out. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you want to support the show, here are a few simple ways. 1, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube, or wherever you listen to the podcast. 2, you can like the show on Facebook or follow along on Twitter, @The Pursuit Zone. 3, you can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or Spotify. This episode was recorded on June 4, 2018. For the show notes and more great adventure travel podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.